Hi, my name is Lauren Walker. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Yellowstone Bird Program. I've been here since 2016. The Yellowstone Bird Program is tasked with monitoring a wide variety of songbird, raptor, and water bird species across the park. So in total, that means that we monitor over 150 species of birds that breed in the park in the summer, as well as additional species that move through the park during spring and fall migrations, as well as some species that move into the park solely for the winter season. So that's a big task. And one way that we assess kind of broad scale how birds in general are doing is through surveys such as the breeding bird survey in the summer. So breeding bird surveys are an international program throughout the US, Canada, and Mexico that have been going on since the 1960s across the continent. In Yellowstone, we've been doing them consistently since the late 1980s, 1987. We have 3 survey routes through the park, and they follow roads, and they are designed to capture kind of overall diversity and abundance of birds along those routes. In this figure, I'm showing you just songbirds, but these kind of general trends are similar for both raptors and water bird species as well. And what you can see is that there are some differences between the 3 routes. One goes through Mammoth, one goes through kind of from Tower to the northeast entrance, and one comes from Dunraven down to Lake along the road there. And while there are some differences between routes, they're largely similar patterns between the 3. The biggest differences come between study years, and those differences are driven by management decisions and habitat changes, including things like the 1988 fire, which resulted in a noticeable dip in songbird abundance for several years. The predator recovery in the mid-1990s, we expected to see impacts on songbird numbers as a result of that, because as wolves were reintroduced and impacted ungulate species in the park, the habitats that ungulates browsed, so in grasslands and particularly in willows, those habitats then became affected by reduced browse levels, and that allowed some changes to the songbirds that lived in those habitats. Kind of an overarching question mark is how kind of these long-term how the long-term impacts of things like climate change will continue to impact songbirds into the future. So I'm going to kind of walk you through our main core programs of the core bird program here, and then give you a few examples of kind of some more specific things that we're looking at and kind of the drivers of some of the monitoring that we're doing. So I'll start with our Raptor program, and our Raptor program really has focused largely on bald eagles, osprey, and peregrine falcon. Those are kind of our long-running programs. More recently, we've added owls, golden eagles, and red-tailed hawks. And for all these species, our primary motivation for monitoring them are the changing prey resources within the park and the potential effects of climate change again. So one example of changing prey resources are at Yellowstone Lake and the decline in the availability of cutthroat trout in the lake to fish-eating raptors like osprey, as well as bald eagles. So osprey rely fully on fish. That's pretty much the only thing they eat. And historically, there was 50 to 60 territories, osprey nests on Yellowstone Lake. In the 1980s, with the reintroduction, or excuse me, the introduction of the invasive lake trout, we began to see declines in the number of cutthroat trout in the lake. Unfortunately, lake trout don't make a suitable food source for osprey. They grow too large and they tend to inhabit deeper waters outside the range of osprey. And as a result of this, we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of osprey territories on the lake, down from 50 or 60 to 1 or 2 in recent years. Elsewhere throughout the park, osprey territories are relatively stable, and they seem to be doing fine. Kind of in contrast to osprey, bald eagles on Yellowstone Lake they showed a slight dip and then seem to be bouncing back to some degree, and they are more dietarily flexible than osprey. So even if at one point they were fairly reliant on cutthroat, it's likely that they've adapted to using different prey sources. So we believe that they are now relying more on things like waterfowl, in particular waterfowl nestlings and fledglings. So pelicans, swans, even loons, as well as Canada geese, which are common on the lake. So as another kind of example of our questions that we have about raptors is, you can see here with golden eagles, there's extreme variability in both nest success, and that's the number or the proportion of nests that succeed in fledging at least one young every year, as well as in variability in the productivity of those nests. Like, do they fledge 1 or 2 or 3 young? What is the average productivity of a successful nest? So year to year, those metrics have varied for golden eagles from 75% of nests succeeding all the way to 0, from one year to the next. And that's fairly dramatic. And recent research in the park has looked at things like habitat conditions, extreme weather events, as well as prey availability, and those are continue to be driving questions that we hope to be able to answer with more years of data. An issue that seems to be particularly concerning for golden eagles, but also for other raptors, is lead poisoning. Both goldens and bald eagles, range widely in order to find their food sources, and they both forage off of carcasses. And during hunting season, this means that they could be foraging off of hunter-killed carcasses with lead bullets. And we have had an example of one of our study golden eagles that died due to lead poisoning outside the park. So moving on to our waterbird program, this is a fairly focused program on a few species. We largely focus on trumpeter swans, common loons, and then 4 species of colonial nesting waterbirds that nest on the Mali Islands. and the southeast arm of Yellowstone Lake. And these islands are, only combined only a few acres, and so that's a small area for those four species to nest in. Our primary concerns for all of these birds are largely due to the fact that they nest on the ground, mostly right along the shoreline of a lake or a pond, and hence they are very susceptible to shoreline flooding. In years with very warm springs or very wet springs, when the water levels rise very quickly, they, if they've already built a nest and have begun incubating, those nests can become flooded, and that would likely kill the eggs that were already laid. Additionally, those shoreline nests make them very vulnerable to human disturbance, both on the water, so people out on rafts, fishing, or kayaking on Yellowstone Lake, and just simply walking the shoreline, hikers and anglers as well. Their nests are generally, they can be fairly well hidden, and so it's easy to kind of unintentionally come across them and surprise these birds. But even a very brief time that the birds are off the nest can expose their eggs or their young to predators or to the elements if it's very cold or very hot. Those conditions can both result in nest failure. And so human disturbance is an ongoing issue that we work with other programs within YCR to balance, allowing for visitor access and solid visitor experiences in the backcountry and at these lakes, but also with protecting these waterbird nests. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of focus on trumpeter swans. This species is iconic in the park. Birds within the park were the very last kind of holdover population for trumpeter swans in the lower 48. Other than that, they were thought to be extinct through the lower 48 in the 1930s. There was a kind of broad-scale, continent-wide recovery effort in which the species is now doing fairly well across the continent. In Yellowstone, however, we had good recovery and population growth through the 1960s, but has since declined quite dramatically. And today we only have a small handful of breeding pairs of swans. And again, kind of those underlying drivers of that decline are in question. We don't know if it's driven by human disturbance. We don't know if it's driven by changes in habitat, most likely some combination of those factors. I wanted to include these pictures because it just really shows you how dramatic the small changes in water level can affect these ground nesting birds. So the Molly Islands are fairly small even when lake levels are low, but when they rise just a little bit, there's not much elevation on the island, so they go underwater fairly quickly. And these two pictures are of the same island, different times during the same study year. So early on in the season, before there's lots of snow melt and the lake level hasn't risen yet, the birds arrive and they start nesting. And then in a dramatic year where there's lots of flooding, a lot of those nests end up being waterlogged and failing because of that flooding. So finally, I want to talk kind of a little bit about our Songbird program. Songbirds are a very diverse group, and so instead of focusing on individual species, we tend to focus on habitat guilds, and in particular, we look at birds in willow or riparian zones, songbirds in grasslands, songbirds in mature forests, as well as recently burned forests. And then we have a few focused research projects on common ravens and Clark's nutcrackers as well. In general, we were motivated to kind of keep track of birds in these different habitats for a variety of reasons. Again, kind of the overarching question mark of what the potential impacts of climate change will be. Also, management decisions like the reintroduction of wolves in the 90s and the effect on willow habitat in the park in particular, as well as fire management. You know, we used to put all fires out. We've trended more now towards letting wildfires burn, but that has resulted in a shift in our forest structure and our forest diversity, which impacts our songbirds that use those forests. And finally, some invasive species, particularly in grasslands in Yellowstone, affect, again, the habitat structure and the quality for different species. So focusing in on willow and riparian zones, common species that we see in these areas are gray catbird, willow flycatcher, Wilson's warblers, and yellow warblers. These are all kind of willow specialists that really need this type of habitat to nest in. And the photos on the right are from a paper that looked at the recovery of willows post-wolf reintroduction. So wolves have changed the way that elk browse, both because they affect elk behavior and also elk numbers. And that has consequently affected the structure of the willow habitat, allowing it to grow up taller and more dense, creating more nesting habitat for these willow specialists. Another kind of more in-depth way that we look at willow songbirds is through a banding station. And so we capture songbirds in mist nets. And if you look carefully at that top photo, you can kind of see the mesh of the net behind the bird. And then we put a band on them, we take lots of measurements, we look at their feather quality, and we assess the age of the bird and the sex of the bird. And then we let them go and they go back to their lives, but we can get from this data, we can get a better sense of things like songbird productivity in these habitats. We get some information about diversity of species that use the area, species that we don't detect in our normal survey methods. And we also get a sense of, by doing this year to year, we can get a sense of both adult and juvenile survival. So how many birds, in this example, a yellow warbler, how many yellow warblers do we have one year, and then how many of those same birds do we recapture the following year, after they've had to migrate all the way down to South America or Central America and back again. Kind of an additional interesting thing that we've learned from the banding station is when we see different pulses of species. So yellow warblers, which are the yellow line here, and warbling vireos in blue are our most common captures. And this data is just from 2018, but it kind of summarizes the general trends that we've seen over the last few years. Yellow warblers, we get a lot of adults in June, early June, and then we see a big pulse of hatchier birds, so young birds, in early August. Warbling vireos, however, we get most of our captures in kind of mid to late July, and those tend to be mostly adults. Song sparrows, we get a smaller pulse of adults in late July, and then we get some young song sparrows in August. Again, we get another little bump. One species that we didn't necessarily expect to capture many in this banding station was brewer sparrows. They tend to be a grassland bird, and we found that we were capturing them in August, kind of when things dry out a bit at the end of the season, and we suspect that these birds are coming into the willows for both the insects that live there as well as the water that they can find there, now that they were kind of no longer tied to their nesting habitat in grasslands. So in mature forests, we are primarily interested in looking at kind of the differences in diversity and abundance between forest types. And so we looked at Doug fir and spruce forests and compared that with lodgepole and spruce mix, and then kind of these monoculture lodgepole forests that dominate kind of the southern half of the park. And in Doug fir and spruce, we see both greater diversity and greater abundance of forest songbirds. The lodgepole really has few birds to begin with, but also only a select number of species. And this is interesting, but also sort of concerning. Lodgepole is the dominant species that grows back after a large wildfire. So our concern is that if we continue to allow large wildfires to burn, we'll eventually lose the majority of our Doug fir and spruce forests, and thus lose a lot of the habitat that allows for forest songbird diversity in the park. That being said, wildfires are not bad for birds. Some birds actually depend on them, including some woodpeckers and cavity nesters in particular. So cavity nesters are species like swallows, bluebirds, chickadees. All of these species use cavities to nest, and recently burned areas with lots of snags and kind of decaying but yet standing trees are easier to build cavities in, and also tend to have good insect abundance for nests or for nestlings. So we've looked at songbird diversity and abundance across recently burned forests, found that woodpecker abundance really peaked in the first few years after a burn, whereas cavity nesters were equally abundant across the entire survey period, which was up to 5 years post burn. These were largely in the southern portion of the park, so these would be lodgepole forests mainly. All right, so grassland songbirds are amongst the most imperiled songbird guild across the continent because of things like habitat fragmentation and invasive species, encroaching infrastructure. In the park, we have a few different issues than is typical. We have invasive grassland species. We also have large ungulates that move across the landscape through different seasons and affect different areas in different ways, causing some areas, to be fairly denuded, some to have like lush shrubland, structure, and and this varies across our study area for grasslands, which was primarily in the northern range. So in this figure, those five colors represent different study sites across the northern range. And you can see that the abundance of these these five species that I've kind of just selected to show here vary dramatically across these study sites. And so each of those sites has quite a different guild of what the common grassland birds are in those areas. And we continue to work with the bison program in particular to kind of better assess the vegetative characteristics of our sites, as well as the different ways in which ungulates and bison in particular are using these areas and how that might affect the grassland songbirds that we're seeing. So that kind of concludes what I wanted to talk to you about in terms of the Yellowstone Bird Program. We do cover a wide variety of species and a lot of things that I have not had a chance to talk to you about today. I did want to end on a note that reminds you all to please appreciate the birds in the park responsibly and respectfully. Birds are wildlife just like wolves and elk and bears, and we appreciate if you give them the respect of 25 yards distance, just like you would any of those other wildlife species, particularly during the summer nesting season. These birds are very sensitive to people, and we want to minimize the stress that they're under while they're nesting. And to that end, the use of audio calls in the park is illegal, so please do not use your phone to play a bird song to call species in. It is prohibited, as well as feeding birds. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you learned some things about birds in Yellowstone, and thank you.